How many here have ever said anything kind of like this? I wish there were more hours in the day. How many of you said, I've got so many things to do, but there's only one of me, if I could just clone myself. How about this one? Todd, pray for wisdom for me on how to best use my time. Or I'm being pulled in so many directions, I don't know which way is up. Or if someone asks me to do anything else, I'm going to lose my mind. In her book called Not So Fast, Slow Down Solutions for Frenzied Families, Ann Croaker writes this: America, the land of the high-achieving, multitasking speedaholics. We're in perpetual motion, never resting and never quite satisfied. American families are sucked into a vortex of activities and obligations. We pile on appointments, lessons, practices, games, performances, and clubs. And then we shovel in fast food. Western civilization's high-speed, fast-paced, goal-oriented life has propelled us into a state of minivan mania. She goes on to reference a great book, a book called The Life You've Always Wanted by John Ortberg. And in that book, John Ortberg tells of a story. He tells of his life. He was talking to a friend about spiritual direction for himself, and he described his life to his friend. He said, the pace in this Chicago lifestyle I'm in is furious. The rhythm of his family and his life were at full speed, and the condition of his heart was starving for more. And he wanted to know what he could do in order to be a spiritually healthy man. And after a long time, a long pause, his mentor said, well, you must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. Now, Ortberg wasn't satisfied with that answer, so he asked, well, what else can I do? And again, the man said, there's nothing else. You must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. After reflecting on that advice for some time, Ortberg made this observation. He said, hurry is the greatest enemy of the spiritual life in our day. Hurry can destroy our souls. Hurry can keep us from living well. He said, for many of us, the great danger is not that we will renounce our faith. It is that we will become so distracted and rushed and preoccupied that we will settle for a mediocre vision of it. Settle for a mediocre faith. Let me ask again. How many here feel that their to-do lists are a mile long, that their calendar is bulging from the seams? And every day, just in order to get through it, they have to run at full speed, and not just run, but juggle 10 different things in the air until they get to the end, and they still don't get it all done. See, it sounds like to me that we really have not embraced the simple truth that we've been talking about for the last few weeks. We've not embraced that into our life. How do we get back to Jesus if we can't even find a moment to spend with Him? If we can't even catch our breath? Today I want to tell you a story. It's a story that you have probably heard many times in your life. It's a story about two sisters. The sisters' names were Mary and Martha. Mary and Martha. Now, Mary and Martha, they both loved Jesus. And so they invited Him over, along with His friends, to their home. Now, here's what happened when they get there. Martha invites Jesus over, and she's so excited that He's coming that she's rushing around and she's cleaning up the house. You know, she went into the guest bedrooms and she stripped the beds and she put new sheets on there in case they wanted to spend the night. And she quickly dusted and threw the magazines under the couch so no one could see all the clutter. She ran into the dining room and she set the table. She made sure that there weren't any spots on the dishes, on the forks, made everything was laid out perfectly right. She runs into the kitchen and she starts to prepare for supper. Jesus' favorite, lasagna. I'm sure that's his favorite. It'd be my favorite, but. And while Martha is doing all this work, she turns and she realizes my sister Mary is nowhere to be found. And so she starts walking through the house looking for her, and there Mary sits at the feet of Jesus there in the family room, listening to all that is going on, absorbed into the conversation. Martha doesn't do anything right away. Who would? She goes on about her business. She goes on about her busyness, I should say. But it just keeps eating at her and eating at her. As she feverishly works, the fact that Mary is just sitting there is driving her crazy. And it just continues to eat at her last nerve until she can take it no more. And she runs in to the family room, and right in front of everyone, she scolds Mary. But she doesn't just scold Mary, she scolds Jesus too. Jesus, don't you care that I'm doing all the work? Tell my sister Mary to get up and help me. And Jesus responds like this. Luke chapter 10, verses 41 and 42. He says, Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed. Or indeed, only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. What a powerful truth. Did you see the simple truth that Jesus reveals? You worry about so many things, but the one thing you need to do is listen to me, Jesus says. You're worried about all these issues, but all you really need to do is listen. Jesus is calling us to listen to Him. Over all the distractions that life throws at us, listen to me. Make a priority out of listening to me, Jesus says. Now, if you would ask a Christian, in fact, I would submit that nearly every Christian, you ask them, hey, do you listen to Jesus? Oh, yes, I listen to Jesus. Who doesn't listen to Jesus? I'm a Christian. Surely I listen to Jesus. But do you really listen to Jesus? I mean, I think it's easy to say we listen to Jesus, but what does listening to Jesus really look like? Really look like? The first thing you need to understand about listening to Jesus is listening requires solitude. Listening requires solitude. Psalm chapter 46, verse 10, the very first part of that verse, it says, be still and know that I am God. God tells us, hey, you have to slow down. You have to find a quiet place. If you want to hear my voice, you're gonna have to take a deep breath and find a place where you can just listen. We rarely, as a nation, we rarely allow a single moment in our lives to really have our attention. Me and my wife will sit on the sofa in the evening to watch TV, and here's what we do. TV is on. It's a program that I've already recorded. So the TV is on in front of us, watching the TV. I've got my phone, and I'm playing a game. Sometimes I have my laptop open, and I'm looking at things on the internet. She's over there on her tablet, and she's playing the same game I am, but so we're playing back and forth some, and we're watching TV. And so when it comes to commercial, I can fast forward it, so I pause my game, fast forward the TV, get to the next thing, turn it back on, and start my game right back up. I mean, what? There's conversation going on there too, but I don't know what it was. Maybe you like it like this. You're driving. Your kids are yelling in the back seat. you're a Christian, so you got Christian radio cranked up as loud as you can, and you're reaching behind there, grabbing for a knee or anything you can grab a hold of to try to settle them down. And then your phone rings while you're driving, and you look to make sure you're not missing something that's scheduled, or it's not an important text, or something's not going on. And all this while you're trying to drive the car. We can't do one thing, and just one thing in our lives anymore. So how do we expect to really hear Jesus if we can't hear ourselves think? Because of all the urgencies of life. I see everyone putting on their jackets. Are you getting freezing in here? Okay, I get people going back and forth. All right. Well, if you're not cold yet, listen to this story. Before refrigerators, people used ice houses to preserve their food. And ice houses had these big, thick walls. They had no windows. They had a tight-fitting door. And during the winter, when the lakes or rivers froze, they would go out and they'd cut these huge blocks of ice, as big as they could get them. They'd haul them to the ice house, slide them in there, cover them with sawdust. And sometimes that ice would last well into the summer. Well, in those days, a man was working in the ice house, and he lost his watch, his pocket watch. It's very valuable. Fell out of his pocket somewhere, and he couldn't find it. He searched and searched and searched diligently, looking through the sawdust, trying to find this watch, but he never could. And so his fellow workers asked, what's going on? What are you looking for? I've lost my watch. So they help. His fellow workers, they're searching through the sawdust. They're trying to find this man's watch, and they too cannot find it. Their efforts prove futile. So they give up and they think, well, we're at least going to go eat lunch and we'll come back and look afterwards. But a small boy was watching all this transpire. He realized what was going on. He heard them say that they were looking for a watch. And so as they went off for lunch, he went into the ice house. And during their lunch break, he quickly emerged carrying the watch. Now they were amazed. They said, how in the world did you find the watch? We looked for it for an hour and we couldn't find it. And the young boy replied, he said, I closed the door, I laid down on the sawdust, and I kept very still. And soon I heard the watch ticking. See, the question is not whether God speaks or not, but whether we are still enough, quiet enough to listen. To listen. In Mark chapter 1, verse 35, it says, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Let me ask you a question. If Jesus, the Son of God, considered it extremely important to spend quiet time, alone time, solitary time with God, shouldn't we? Shouldn't we? Let me ask you, can you be really honest with yourself? Can you be really honest with yourself? How many of you are spending time with God? In fact, let me ask you this question. How much time are you spending with God? And how much time are you spending on Facebook? The second thing we need to understand about listening is that listening requires recognizing Jesus' voice. If you want to listen, you're going to have to know who you're listening to. And the world is bombarding us with voice after voice after voice. So we've got to be very cautious who we listen to. In John chapter 10, verse 27, Jesus says, my sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me. Do you really know the voice of Jesus? I mean, as you live your daily life, do you really know the voice of Jesus? Do you hear the voice of Jesus? Are you touched by the voice of Jesus? Wayne Cordero reports that he's a preacher in Honolulu, and one day he was talking about the voice of God, and the kids came up and they said, well, do you really hear the voice of God? And Wayne said, yes, I hear the voice of God. And they said, well, what does the voice sound like? And he looked at him and he said, well, I bet you think it sounds like this booming, low, powerful voice that just booms into your mind, splits the heavens. And they're all looking, yeah. He said, no. He said, the voice of God sounds like the Bible. The voice of God sounds like the Bible. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, it says this, all Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. How can we know God's voice if we don't know Scripture? Well, the preacher said, well, that's good. I hope the preacher wouldn't mislead you. I'm going to try not to. But that's the preacher's voice. Well, my parents said, well, that's your parents' voice. My teacher said, or my friend said, well, that's your teacher or friend's voice. What about God's voice? Have you heard God's voice? A minister once told the congregation, he says, next week I plan to preach about the sin of lying. So in order to help you understand the sermon, I want you all to read Mark chapter 17. So the following Sunday, as he prepared to deliver his sermon, the minister asked for a show of hands. He wanted to know how many people had read Mark 17, and every hand in the church flew up. And then the minister smiled and said, Mark only has 16 chapters. I will now proceed with my sermon on the sin of lying. Now let me ask you, would you have known that Mark only had 16 chapters? Do you? God is speaking, but we have to understand His voice because it's His Word. Are you listening? If you aren't in His Word, then you will not be able to recognize His voice. You have to be in His Word. The last thing I want to talk about listening today is that listening requires obedience. Listening requires us to obey. I want to read to you Matthew chapter 7. You're familiar with it, verse 24 through 27. Jesus talking, He says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the wind blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Think about what Jesus is trying to proclaim to us here, trying to make us understand, trying to get us to absorb into our life. He's saying, you can hear me without listening. You can have knowledge, but without action, it's useless. Francis Chan, he did the rope illustration I had a few weeks ago that we put up on the screen. He wrote Crazy Love, Forgotten God, and some other books that I can't remember all the names of right now. He's one of my favorite authors. I really enjoy him. Francis Chan laments about the church. This is what he says. He says, we're too often missing the level of commitment and passion of spreading the gospel message that the early church had. He says, you go to church these days and you stare forward, you sing a couple of songs, you listen to the message, and then you go home. Haven't you wondered how come everyone's so content and everyone acts like that's the norm and that that's okay? When your heart is driving you crazy and it just doesn't seem to square with Scripture. He goes on, he says, I feel very concerned for those people who walk into these buildings we call church and think they are Christians because they said a prayer and made a decision. He said, saying a prayer means nothing if there is no follow through. He continues, where is the obvious truth and where is the obedience? If we have heard what we are supposed to do and haven't done it, it's sin. In James chapter 4, verse 17, that's exactly what it says. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. When we come face to face with the expectations of Jesus and we don't do them, it's not just optional, it's sinful. We can't claim to listen to Jesus if we deny Him with our lives. We can't claim to walk in the truth if it's just lip service and not life service. What have you heard from Jesus? Are you listening? Are you obeying? See, the simple truth is if we want to get back to following Jesus, we're just going to have to listen to Him. Listen to Him. And that takes time, being alone with Him. And that means being familiar with His Word. And that means being willing to obey even when it's scary, even when it's hard, what He says. So what needs to change in your schedule? What needs to change in your life? What needs to change in your behavior so that you can really listen to Jesus? See, I want you to understand we can escape the frenzied life that we are caught up in. But in order to do that, we have to listen to Jesus.